The storm outside raged like a beast untamed, the mountain winds howling through the cracks of the old timber lodge. But inside, the fire roared with a different kind of hunger, one that flickered between two souls who had been circling each other for far too long. He stood there, tall, rugged, his broad shoulders casting shadows across the cabin walls, his breath steady but his eyes burning with the weight of unspoken words. The kind of man who carried a past that left scars no one could see. And yet tonight, with her standing before him, trembling but unyielding, he felt a pull stronger than any pain he had ever endured. She, delicate yet fierce, her heart torn between fear and longing, had run from a life that caged her, finding herself here in this wilderness where everything was wild and nothing could be tamed, least of all the connection that tied her to him. Their journey to this moment had been anything but simple. Days of silence, broken by stolen glances, nights spent listening to the fire crackle, while their hands brushed ever so slightly, as if fate itself teased them with possibilities. And now, with the storm forcing them close, there was nowhere left to hide from what had been building. His voice was deep, low, carrying the weight of both promise and warning as he stepped closer, whispering, "Once I touch you, there's no turning back." And his words were not just about flesh or passion, but about forever, about crossing into something neither of them could undo, a bond stronger than blood or stone, a vow spoken without ceremony. She looked up at him, her breath shaky yet filled with quiet courage, her eyes shimmering like the storm-lit glass behind her, and she answered with a softness that carried more power than any scream. Then let it happen, because she knew in her bones that she wanted no safety net, no escape, only him, only this moment that would change everything. When his hand finally reached for hers, the world seemed to hold its breath. The fire dimmed, the storm quieted, and it was as though time itself bent to witness what love, raw and unfiltered, could do to two people who had once believed themselves too broken to ever feel whole again. He pulled her closer, not with force but with reverence, as though she were both his salvation and his undoing. And when her body met his, the warmth was more than heat. It was the kind of fire that mended shattered pieces, that erased doubts and replaced them with certainty. She leaned into him, her fingers curling into the rough fabric of his shirt, her lips trembling, not from fear but from the weight of surrender. And in that surrender she found strength, the courage to embrace the unknown, to give herself to a man who did not just want her body but her soul. His whisper against her ear was a vow etched into eternity. "You'll never be alone again." And with those words, the storm outside became nothing more than a distant echo, because inside the cabin a different storm had found its calm. What followed was not simply passion, but the weaving of two hearts into one rhythm, their silence filled with promises, their touch carving pathways to a forever they had both thought unreachable. She cried not out of sorrow, but out of release, as years of pain dissolved beneath the certainty of his arms, and he held her as if letting go would mean the world would collapse. Their love was not a spark that burned quick and bright, but a fire that would never die, a flame that would carry them through every trial the mountains, the world, and life itself would hurl their way. When morning came, the storm outside had broken, leaving the world washed clean, and as sunlight spilled through the window, she opened her eyes to see him still watching her, his gaze steady, protective, and unyielding. And in that gaze she knew, once he touched her, there had been no turning back, and she was glad, for she had never wanted to. Together they rose from the bed, their hands entwined, ready to face whatever came next, not as two wandering souls, but as one force bound by love. And in the stillness of that mountain morning, she smiled, whispering, "Thank you for not letting me run," to which he replied with a grin that softened his rugged face, "You were never meant to run. You were meant to stay here with me." And so their story began not with an ending but with a choice, a surrender, a promise that whispered through the cabin walls and out into the wild, declaring to the world that sometimes love doesn't ask for permission. It simply claims what was always meant to be. The morning after the storm carried with it a fragile stillness, a silence so deep that it felt as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath, watching the two of them step into a new reality bound not just by desire but by a vow they had sealed in whispers and touch. She awoke to the warmth of his body beside her, the safety of his arm wrapped protectively around her waist, and for the first time in years, she did not feel hunted by fear or chained by memories, but safe, seen, and wanted. Yet safety was never a promise in these wild lands, for the mountain held secrets and dangers of its own, and beyond these timber walls, The past they had both been running from waited like a shadow, unwilling to die. He rose early, his body moving with the quiet strength of a man who had lived his life, surviving both wilderness and war within himself. And when she opened her eyes to find him sharpening an axe by the fire, his presence filled her chest with a strange ache, a hunger not only for his touch but for his steadiness. His promise that she was no longer alone, but deep inside. Fear whispered, what if this fragile happiness shattered? What if choosing him meant putting him in danger from the demons that followed her? He caught her watching, and in that rugged half-smile of his, she felt her worries quiet, because his eyes said what his lips did not, that he had already decided, already claimed her, already prepared to bear whatever burden came with loving her. She rose, pulling his shirt over her delicate frame, the scent of smoke and pine clinging to it, and when she walked toward him, his gaze darkened, not just with desire but with something deeper, something that told her he saw her not as fragile but as fierce, even in her brokenness. You're not used to staying, are you? He asked, his voice low, his hand pausing on the blade, and she looked down, her lips trembling as she confessed, all my life. I've been told I wasn't enough to stay for, that I was meant to be left behind. And those words cut deeper than any knife, for he knew what it was to feel discarded by the world. He set the axe aside and crossed to her, his fingers brushing her cheek with reverence as he whispered, then let me be the man who proves them all wrong. Because if there's one thing I know, it's that once I've chosen, I never let go. And she melted into him, tears blurring her vision. Not because she was weak, but because no one had ever said such words to her. Without condition or demand, the day stretched long as they worked side by side, him splitting wood, her tending the fire, both of them moving like two souls learning the rhythm of a new life, and every brush of his hand against hers, every glance that lingered too long, pulled them closer into a bond that felt unshakable. But when the sun sank low and the shadows grew long, the mountain reminded them of its truth, for danger lurked beyond beauty, and as wolves howled in the distance, she shivered, not from cold but from memory, from the echo of voices that had once mocked her, used her, cast her aside. He noticed his hand sliding into hers, grounding her as he said, "They'll never touch you again." And though he meant the wolves, she knew his words went deeper, to the men from her past, to the scars etched in her heart. That night, as firelight painted their faces gold, she whispered truths she had never spoken aloud, of betrayal, of nights she had begged to be loved and mornings she had woken to nothing but silence. And he listened, every muscle in his body, coiled with restrained fury, not at her, but at those who had hurt her. And when she finished, he took her hand and pressed it against his chest, where his heart beat steady and strong, saying, "Hear that? As long as it beats, you're safe. And if anyone tries to take you from me, they'll have to silence this first." And in that moment, she understood what it meant when he had said, "There's no turning back," because love like this was not temporary. It was not fragile. It was a fire that would burn through any storm. Yet love also brought fear, for she now had something to lose, someone who could be taken. And that thought haunted her even as she surrendered more deeply to him, as their lips met in a kiss that was not gentle, but consuming, their bodies pressed together, with a hunger that was less about desire and more about sealing their fate again and again, ensuring the universe itself knew they belonged to each other. The night stretched on, passion mixing with laughter, confessions blending with silence, until exhaustion claimed them both, tangled in blankets and promises. But as dawn broke, a shadow loomed, a figure outside the cabin, watching, waiting, carrying with him the past she thought she had escaped. And when he rose to the sound of the dogs barking, the axe already in his hand, she felt her stomach drop, because she knew the storm between them was only just beginning.